Hi there, I'm your host, John Ivison, and this week I'm joined by one of the only economists with whom I see eye to eye, and that's because he's 6'4" too. He is Ken Boessenkool. Ken, welcome.
Good to be here.
Ken is a partner at the policy advisory shop Meredith Boessenkool Phillips. He teaches at the Max Bell School of Public Policy at McGill University and is a long-time research fellow at the C.D. Howe Institute. However, long before all of that, he was advising politicians like Stockwell Day and Stephen Harper, offering not only policy advice, but strategic advice, political advice, which is a rare combination in my experience in Canadian politics, that you have one person doing both of those things. And you were a key player in the Canadian Alliance Progressive Conservative merger. I think you pretty much single-handedly wrote the platform in 2004, it's hard to believe all of that was 20 years ago, right?
We're not getting any younger. Or I'm not anyway. You look younger.
Do you think I look younger? Maybe the same.
I don't know. That was just me being nice.
I seem to remember that platform was leaked, right? Am I right in that? It not to me, but to somebody.
You're bringing back some bad memories. I always say I've had a couple of experiences like that, and I want to go back to the journalists that found it and figure out exactly how, because we never figured out how we got it.
I can't offer any light on that at all, I'm afraid. There were other leaks that I could perhaps. Generally, I find that the person who leaked it is then put in charge of the leak inquiry, and nothing is ever found. So,
yeah, I love it when ministers go on and say they can get quoted, and then the source says someone close to the minister when it's actually the minister themselves. That always makes me laugh.
That's a bit of a transparent old trick. Anyway, nice as it is to take a trip down memory lane, I hope we can rely on your long experience to look at today's political landscape. Starting with the by-elections from earlier this week, there was a new City News poll. It suggests that only 21% of respondents in Canada's 4 largest cities believe Justin Trudeau should be re-elected, which reinforces what we've seen in St. Paul's in Toronto and then this week in La Salle in Montreal. How bad are things for the Liberals when Edmonton is the best performing of the big cities for them?
Well, look, their numbers were bad last week. Their numbers are bad this week, and I expect their numbers are going to be bad next week. And so, it's a continuation of bad news. But on the flip side, you didn't mention that I did some work with Christy Clark, but I was her chief of staff and ran her leadership for a while. And she was 22% behind in the polls when I was there, and she won the next election. Now, she was a new leader, so maybe there's something there, but it's not a foregone conclusion. Justin Trudeau is a formidable campaigner. If I were Pierre Poilievre, I wouldn't be putting many of my tools down, that's for sure.
It does seem that the numbers are starting to go in the right direction. I mean, we saw inflation down to 2% this week. The consensus on Bay Street is that we're going to see another probably 200 basis points off interest rates, which would essentially take them to half of where they were last summer. Do you think that, let's say we get into next summer, do you think that would have any impact, or are they just too far gone? The demand for change is just too high.
You get blamed when things go bad, but you don't often get credit when things go well. In the first place, on the other, when I talk to Liberals these days, I get flashbacks. You talked earlier about my flashbacks. So I get flashbacks to 2014 when we convinced ourselves that Stephen Harper might be able to win the next election. And, I still think he could have won that election. But 9-10 years is sort of the useful life of a government these days. And these guys are getting close. So you really need something extraordinary to break out. And certainly, I have older children. My oldest is 32 or 33, and she's never experienced inflation in her entire life. And suddenly the price of chicken over the last 4 years has gone up 20%. And she's like, what? Like, she doesn't even know how to process that. So you have all these millennials who, for the first time in their life, and the price of chicken is not going to come down by 20%, right? Like, it's going to stay up. Now, she lives in Lethbridge, so she could afford to buy a house and raise their children there. But if she lived a lot of other places in the country, the idea of owning a home would be impossible. So it's interesting that these younger voters are the ones that Pierre Poilievre is getting. Ironically, the folks who elected Justin Trudeau in 2015 look to be the exact folks that'll get Pierre Poilievre, would elect Pierre Poilievre today. We'll see what happens a year from now. But today, anyway, they're lining up behind Pierre Poilievre.
Do you think the Liberals are paying the price for almost entirely focusing on Justin Trudeau? And they benefited from that for many years, but now he's just sort of yesterday's breakfast to many of them, and the party goes with him.
Yeah, I mean, there's a risk that no one hears the message because they're sick of the messenger, and I think they're suffering from that. They certainly have put him in the front window for a long time. I remember going to BC to be Christy Clark's chief of staff, and I don't think she would be embarrassed for me to tell this story. But I said to her, "You're on the news every night, Christy. Like you're overexposed. Like, can we pull back a little bit?" And we went from daily news conferences to like weekly, and just getting her out of people's faces every day, and that actually it helped. So I might have the same advice for those guys: put a few other people in the window.
Right. I mean, Chrétien had the same idea, right? He just doing nothing was not seen as bad government.
Yeah, well, Stephen Harper used to, all you journalists used to complain that Stephen Harper didn't do enough news conferences, and he said that one of the most honest things to reporters I ever heard him say, which is, if I have something to say, I'll come out and say it. And if I don't have something to say, I'm not going to come out and say nothing. Right? And that was his view. But I don't think he got quite as overexposed as Trudeau and Christy Clark in her early days was.
Yeah, yeah. And I also think that the news cycle is so different now with social media that you're sort of omnipresent 24 hours a day in a way that you just weren't 20 years ago.
I don't even think it makes sense to call it a news cycle. It's just like,
no, it doesn't.
Middle of the night, your phone goes off and you're looking at your phone, right? Like there's no such thing as a cycle.
Yeah. Turning briefly to Winnipeg, how much of that result was due to Wab Kinew, the premier? I know you like this guy. You tweeted about him.
Yeah.
And, he seems to be. I mean, there's a new Angus Reid poll out that says he's 20 points more popular than the next most popular premier in the land.
Well, starting with Wab, what I like about him is he finds a way to address issues that you think are normally the strength of people across the aisle. So we talked about a while ago, he talked about the need for Canada to get to a 2% spending on military. And, for a new Democrat to say stuff like that and say it credibly, at the end of a bunch of sentences that talked about his progressive ideals, he just has a way of communicating. And his back to school message with that little chalkboard, like he's just a fun guy. But, I once worked for a politician who was good at communicating. His name was Stockwell Day, and some smart guy gave me some advice. His name was Stephen Harper, and said, he talks a good line, but he doesn't actually do anything. And so, I think Wab is very impressive, but now let's see if he can actually accomplish a few things. But look, I do think that rubbed off a bit. The NDP won that by-election. I think we Conservatives were within striking distance at one point of winning that, and they clawed it back. I think a bunch of new Democrats are trying to credit their leader's flip on the carbon tax. I'm not sure that had enough to do with it. Those kind of messages take a long time to penetrate. But I do think the NDP is popular in Manitoba, and Wab Kinew is just he's got some great cabinet ministers too. To be honest, his finance minister is very impressive. But it's a young new government with a young new leader, and I think a lot of people want him to succeed for all kinds of reasons, including the first Indigenous premier in Canada. So I think he's got a lot of people, whether they're from left, right, or center, sort of quietly clapping for him.
There was another Angus Reid poll out this week. This one was trying to assess the potential and hypothetical Conservative Party policies. It said that balancing the budget, lowering income tax, increasing jail time for criminals, and spending more on defence were pretty popular, not surprisingly perhaps. Privatising more healthcare and defunding the CBC were seen as bad ideas. If we can take a few of these in turn, I mean, balancing the budget and cutting taxes are obviously popular, but they require savings to be made elsewhere, particularly in this tight fiscal environment we're in. Yet, one of the obvious options would be firing a large number of public servants. That was deemed to be not popular. So if you were advising on policy, what would you be suggesting right now? The Liberals and NDP are already making the case that a Conservative government would be about cuts and austerity, specifically on dental care and pharma. How do you blunt that attack? And do you keep dental and pharma?
I mean, not surprisingly, spending more and taxing less is popular, but the math doesn't add up when you're in government when you do that. Look, I think there are some things that the Liberal New Democrat coalition has done that the Conservatives can build on. I actually like the idea of a dental care program. I find it fascinating that we have an addition to the healthcare system, and the contracting and running of that system is being contracted out to a private firm. It's being run, but privately, and you still have private options for dental care even though there's a public component. It's all very interesting because, and this was introduced by the New Democrats. So we have a new healthcare system that's essentially a European style healthcare system, the dental program. And I can't help but think if that works and it's done well, might be an interesting model for the rest of the healthcare system. And you can always point back and say, look, it was the New Democrats and the Liberals who created this system run by a private company. You can still have private options, all the things we supposedly can't talk about in our public healthcare system. So I'm very fascinated by the way that system was designed. And Howard Anglin wrote a piece a while ago, and he's close to Pierre Poilievre. I've also, a number of us have said, maybe the dental care is a program that we should look at keeping and maybe even expanding. Pharmacare, I'm a different mind on that one. I think that's more provincial jurisdiction. There's a lot of provinces that have programs in place. We can compare what BC is doing with what Alberta is doing with what Manitoba is doing and figure out which is the best way to do it. I'm not sure a one-size-fits-all from Ottawa is the right thing. But the reality is the pharmacare program they brought in is like, 3 or 4 different medications across 3 or 4 different diseases. So it's a pretty sparse program. Pierre is going to deliver a tax cut because he's going to get rid of the carbon tax or the consumer carbon tax. So how many more tax cuts he can do? He's going to announce a commission to tell us what he's going to do on taxes after he's elected, which I found quite fascinating, as opposed to what we did in the Harper years, is tell everyone before we got elected what we're going to do. So the one other thing that I think is a monkey wrench, and I alluded to it before with Wild Canoe, if Canada's going to spend 2% of GDP on national defense, and if we're going to get kicked out of NATO by the Americans and the Europeans, who are all spending 2% of GDP, that's $18 billion a year we got to find. And I think if and when Pierre Poilievre becomes prime minister, and he's got to find $18 billion to meet those commitments of 2% of GDP spent on defense, there's not a lot of money left for anything else. So it's going to be tight and it's going to be tough. But Pierre Poilievre's been around politics, been in government. He arguably one of the best prepared individuals to be prime minister. If you look back at other prime ministers, he's been in a government for 9 years. He was in cabinet, right? Like, he had all this experience. So I think he's up to the job.
More broadly, there does seem to be an apprehension about an incoming Conservative government that's not specific about any particular policy. This same Angus Reid poll suggested 46% say they're fearful and 54% say they suspect a hidden agenda. Now, you and I have seen hidden agendas come and go in every election since 2000 probably. It's not new, but I guess it can't be ignored.
Yeah, look, in 2006, we came up with a very detailed platform. We announced a policy every day, and everyone said, oh, that's an interesting approach. But the real reason we did that is that Canadians thought Stephen Harper had a hidden agenda. And we thought if we tell them what a big, huge public agenda we have, and we never made it explicitly, but the implicit argument is they have to do all this stuff that they talked about. They're not going to have time for their hidden agenda. And we liked their public agenda. So, and that really worked when we were doing polling in 2006. There were a lot of people concerned with the hidden agenda. But it turned out when we did a policy day that concern went away.
Right. So finally, let me read back something that you and another tall economist, Mike Moffat, wrote in 2021. And you said there's no credible winning coalition for any party that can be constructed without some form of carbon tax. Now, later, as a part of a group called Conservatives for Clean Growth, you pushed the idea that climate policy matters, while clarifying that a credible climate change policy doesn't necessarily need a consumer carbon tax. Where do you think we are right now, given the fact that the NDP, as you mentioned, has U-turned on supporting a consumer carbon tax? Do you think it's dead? And would a Conservative government, in your opinion, keep the industrial emitters component, which is really the heavy lifting part of the carbon regime?
Look, there's a huge gap between what Conservatives say and what Conservatives do. And I hate to admit this, but it's true. When they say Jason Kenney ran on axe to tax, and he beefed up the industrial carbon price in Alberta. Danielle Smith ran on axe to tax, and she also beefed up she not only beefed up the industrial carbon price in Alberta, she said she was going to go to $170. She committed to doing that. And as you mentioned, that's the heavy lifting. And so all these and the third interesting point is that a Quebec newspaper, I think it was La Presse, reported that Pierre Poilievre was going to get rid of the industrial carbon price. And within like an hour, they sent a correction saying that's not what he said. And so the industrial carbon price in Alberta, it's 70% of emissions are subject to a carbon price. It's on the industrial side. And I just don't see any government in any future getting rid of that, conservative, liberal, or New Democrat. So what Mike Moffat and I wrote is true. It will remain. The question is, will it continue to get more stringent? Will it continue to get tighter? And I think the answer to that question is almost certainly yes. I mean, if Daniel Smith's going to promise to go to 170, I think other prime ministers and premiers, and it's aimed at business community. It's very popular to say those guys should cut their emissions and I shouldn't. So now we're down to the consumer carbon price. And, I have a slight preference for, that consumer carbon price over other methods. But the reality is, in many countries, they don't have a consumer carbon price. And so there are other ways to get at this solution. So, as I think I wrote, I don't even, if I wrote this with Chris Reagan, I think, it's like the death of the carbon tax is here, long live the carbon tax. So what I would argue is about a third of it is going to go, that's the consumer side, and 2/3 is going to stay. I mean, Doug Ford is even implementing the industrial carbon price, and I just don't see anyone getting rid of that. The question, and I'm always worried about Andrew Leach writing me a note when I do these interviews. The question that he keeps asking me is, will conservatives continue to ratchet up and make the industrial carbon price more stringent? And I think the answer to that is yes, because there will continue to be public pressure to do something about climate change.
Yeah, and you think, does Poilievre need to do anything extra, or he just says we're killing the climate, we're killing the consumer tax, and we're going to keep the industrial emitters?
Yeah, I don't even think he needs to say that. There are people who disagree with this. I think he could get rid of all the federal legislation. The reality is, I don't think there's a province in Canada, maybe Saskatchewan, where the federal government is running the industrial carbon price. So the consumer carbon price in Alberta, Saskatchewan, Ontario is run by the federal government, but the industrial one is in BC, in Alberta, in Ontario, in Quebec. And I think in most provinces now, the provinces are running their own industrial carbon price. So it's not even there's nothing Pierre Poilievre can do to kill the TIER, which is what it's called in Alberta, the TIER program in Alberta.
Yeah.
That's an Alberta program. So he doesn't have to do anything about that. So even if he gets rid of all the legislation that puts this framework over it all, that doesn't mean we've gotten rid of the industrial carbon price in Alberta. So again, the distance between rhetoric and reality is interesting. I was just listening to a podcast with Jason Kenney this morning, and he was crowing about how great the TIER program is. Now, he doesn't call it a carbon price because, rhetoric. But it's still there, and it's still working, and it's still making a difference on emissions in Alberta.
Ken, thanks very much for cutting through the rhetoric. We thank you for your time, and good luck.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Cheers.